Elena Cross speaking. Some confessions come from prisons, some from dim rooms where guilt festers. But the one you will hear tonight comes from a place you might recognize. A quiet suburban street lined with trimmed hedges, laughter and trust, where the greatest monster wore the face of a kind old man and smiled as he poisoned those who trusted him. This is not my story, but I have kept it in my archive, because silence like this is too heavy to carry alone. Now you will hear her words, in her own voice, and once you do, I promise, you will never look at your neighbors the same again. I believed in neighborhoods, in the myth that a row of houses with mailboxes and porches created safety, that people who waved from driveways or lent you sugar were by default friends, and I lived under that illusion until the day my son's laughter went silent, replaced by the rattle of machines that could not save him. And in that silence, I began to see what I had been blind to for years. My boy Daniel was 8 years old when sickness crept into him like a shadow. Slow at first fevers that came and went, stomach pains that baffled pediatricians, weakness in his little body that no medicine seemed to cure, and then suddenly his organs began to fail one after another, as if time itself had chosen him to unravel. They called it idiopathic, a word that means unknown, a word that doctors use when they run out of courage, and I buried my son with that word pressed into my chest like a brand, because unknown was not an answer, it was an insult. After the funeral, I walked streets that looked the same but no longer felt familiar, and I noticed things I had ignored before. The acrid smell in the air when the wind shifted, the oily sheen in puddles near the drainage, the way the grass in Leonard Graves's yard seemed too bright, too lush, as if fed by something unnatural. Grief is a lantern. It burns you, but it also lights the dark, and my grief lit every corner of my memory, pulling into focus details I had brushed aside. Leonard was my neighbor, 4 houses down, a man of silver hair and polished manners, a retired chemist who had once been praised in journals for his brilliance in pharmaceuticals, a man who organized charity fundraisers, who donated to hospitals, who handed out the biggest candy bars on Halloween. He was trusted, adored even, the sort of man people described as a pillar of the community, and I had believed it too, until the lantern of grief showed me cracks. I remembered Daniel playing in the yard, digging soil with plastic shovels, his hands covered in dirt, his shoes streaked with mud, and sometimes coming inside with headaches after hours of play. I remembered nights when the air smelled wrong, faint but chemical, a bitter scent that lingered in the throat. And I remembered Leonard walking past with a smile, always a smile, carrying bags too heavy for groceries, bags he took not inside but around the back of his property where no one ever followed. Memory is cruel. It sharpens once it is too late, and mine sharpened into suspicion. I began to watch him, not out of idle curiosity but out of hunger, the hunger grief breeds when answers are stolen from you. At first it was small, noting the times his lights burned late in the basement, hearing the faint hum of equipment through open windows, seeing delivery trucks pull up with boxes marked with labels I did not recognize. Then it became more. Walking past his yard at night, catching the scent again, chemical and sharp, seeping through vents along his foundation, following him when he drove to warehouses on the edge of town, places that sold industrial supplies no retired man should need. My heart told me what my mind feared to admit. Leonard Graves was not retired. He was continuing his experiments not in labs with oversight, but in secret, using his own home as a playground for chemistry too dangerous to be licensed. And if my son had sickened without cause, if his body had failed without explanation, what better explanation than the toxins leaching into the soil where he played, toxins seeded by a man my community trusted? I collected fragments like a crow, piecing together what I could. I found records of his old research, studies on compounds that regulators had banned, whispers of projects that disappeared from journals without explanation. I spoke with neighbors quietly, asking if their children had ever fallen ill, and some nodded, some hesitated, some looked away, but a few admitted what they never said aloud: stomach pains, unexplained rashes, sudden nosebleeds. I filed requests with the town for soil reports, and when I finally received them, my hands shook, because the numbers screamed what the doctors had not. High levels of toxins, abnormal traces of synthetic compounds that should never exist in a yard, much less near children. Yet when I brought it to officials, they dismissed it as outdated, as inconclusive, and I realized then what kind of shield Leonard carried. Money, reputation, connections. His protection was not built of fences but of silence, and silence is harder to break than steel. So I learned patience, the kind that festers, the kind that builds into something sharper than grief. For months I documented him, photographing deliveries, noting license plates, even sneaking into his trash to recover discarded containers with traces of substances I could not name but could smell. Each time I considered going to the authorities again, I remembered their shrugs, their polite nods, and I remembered Daniel's body lying still beneath white sheets, his eyes closed forever. Truth is a blade, but a blade is useless if it cannot cut, and so I decided my truth would not go to courts or boards, it would go where blades belong. Still, revenge is not born overnight, it requires discipline, and so I trained myself in patience, biding time, waiting for the moment when his arrogance would leave him exposed. That moment came one autumn night when I saw Leonard struggling with drums of liquid in his driveway, heavy barrels he rolled toward the back of his house. I followed at a distance, silent as breath, and I saw where he kept them. A hidden shed, padlocked, half buried in the earth, a place no one but him ever entered. I returned days later, bolt cutters hidden in a bag, and when night covered the street, I slipped inside. The stench hit me first, sour and burning, a mix of solvents and synthetic decay. The barrels were lined against the wall, some open, some leaking into shallow pits in the floor. Papers lay scattered on a desk, formulas, diagrams, notes written in a neat but frantic hand. Experiments continued long after his retirement, experiments that bled poison into the soil. I took photographs of everything, each click of the camera echoing like a vow, but photographs were not enough. I touched the soil where leaks had seeped, and the skin of my fingers burned faintly, a ghost of the pain my son must have carried inside his small body, and in that moment my patience hardened into decision. I confronted him not in daylight, but in shadow, because men like Leonard wear masks too well under the sun. I waited for him near the shed, the air cold, the night silent but for crickets. When he arrived, rolling another barrel, I stepped from the dark and spoke his name. His eyes widened, first in surprise, then in recognition, and finally in dismissal, because arrogance makes men predictable. He called me hysterical, a grieving mother looking for someone to blame, said Daniel's death was tragic, but not his fault. He told me the chemicals were harmless, experiments of curiosity, nothing dangerous, and when I showed him the photographs, the reports, the evidence, he laughed, because laughter is the last refuge of a guilty man. He said no one would believe me that the town owed him that he had bought silence with decades of donations. And in that laugh, I heard every doctor who shrugged, every official who turned away, every hand that waved me back into my grief. And so I struck. The blade I carried was small, a kitchen knife sharpened until it gleamed, but grief makes even the smallest blade mighty. I drove it into him once, deliberate, and his laugh turned into a gasp, his body staggering against the barrels that had poisoned my son. He clutched at the wound, eyes wide not with pain but with disbelief, as if the world had betrayed him by allowing me to exist. He begged then, begged for mercy, begged for silence. But I had carried silence too long, and it had soured inside me into something sharper than steel. I struck again, each movement fueled not by rage but by balance, a ledger being corrected, a debt being paid. He fell among the barrels, his blood mingling with the leaks, a fitting grave for a man who had buried so many in sickness. I left him there, the shed locked behind me, the key tossed into the river where no one would find it. By morning the shed would reek, neighbors might wonder, but the silence he bought would crumble once his absence stretched too long, and when they searched they would find not a saint but a monster drowned in his own sins. I did not need credit. I did not need confession. I needed only to know that Daniel's death was not unanswered. Justice did not come in courtrooms or in headlines. It came in whispers carried by the soil, in the truth buried with Leonard Graves, in the memory of a mother who refused to let silence win. And so I tell this not to seek forgiveness but to ensure memory. Because forgetting is the true crime. Forgetting allows men like Leonard to thrive, and I will not allow it. I carry my son's name in every step, and I carry the truth of what I did in every breath. Perhaps you will call me a murderer, perhaps you will call me mad, but I know what I am. Elena Cross speaking again. I keep her confession in my archive because it reminds me that monsters do not always wear the faces we expect. Sometimes they live next door, sometimes they smile as they poison us, and sometimes justice does not come until grief sharpens it into a blade. Remember this story when you look at your own neighbors, because silence is patient, but it never forgets.